this little thing here. I mentioned I'm up here this morning because I'm a school teacher, but I haven't been teaching for a couple of months, so I'm a little rusty. Okay, today I want to talk about giving, altruism. Altruism can be defined as a behavior that, according to one source, that is costly to the actor and beneficial to the recipient. We all know a certain, or we've heard of a certain small percentage of people who are altruistic. You know, someone who has just won the lottery who gives it all away to a worthy cause. People who work day to day among the homeless. There's even a movement in the United States called effective altruism, where people have pledged over a great deal of their earnings to things like famine relief, so on and so forth. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who are totally indulgent, people who would never think to give a dime to anything, but who would spend $6,000 on a Louis Vuitton purse, or your great Uncle Henry down in Florida who owns a yacht, who thinks the government is wasting its money on food stamps. But most of us are somewhere in the middle. You know, we give to charity from time to time. We all have our favorite charities. We might even tithe. You know, throughout the year, we give up our time for good causes. And we think of ourselves as being generally good people, good guys, so on and so forth. But I recently came across a YouTube video that's got me pondering my attitude toward charity and giving. This video is entitled, "Ordinary People Are Evil." It's about a revolutionary paper published by a philosopher named Peter Singer back in 1972. The name of the paper, by the way, was called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. The basic idea of Singer's paper was that the moral stance that we have toward giving is deeply and profoundly flawed. On the surface, this paper is very persuasive. Singer thinks that our lives as a whole, talking about you, I'm talking about me, need to be reworked if we're going to live in a morally accepted way. In order to understand Singer's argument, there's a technical term that you have to understand. It's not very deep, it's just a big word. The word is supererogatory. Supererogatory simply means doing something nice that you don't have to do. You have a group of friends, they meet every week. There's no rules to this group, but one day they're going to meet and you just feel nice, so you go out and buy them a bunch of donuts. That's supererogatory. Or when you go to Vons, there's that, when you're paying for your groceries, there's that little button you have to push. Do you want to give a poor to the, or do you want to give $1 to the poor of Ventura County? That's supererogatory. You go to the store, your wife sends you to the store for a jar of pickles, and you buy her some flowers and also the pickles. That's supererogatory. Contrasted to that is something called obligatory. You are obliged to do it. There are consequences if you don't do it. If you enter into a contract, you are obliged to fulfill that contract. If you're obliged to pay your taxes, you're obliged to remember your wife's birthday. There can be consequences for not doing that. Now, in this world, there are, and you all know this, there are people who are in serious need. Throughout the world, there are people dying of famine. There are people dying early of diseases. There are people on the move due to war or climate change. There are people in need throughout the world. There are also organizations like Save the Children, Oxfam International, Catholic Relief Services, so on and so forth, that have the means to mitigate these people's suffering. And then there are you and I who are, relatively speaking, affluent. You know, I just paid the water bill and I don't feel very affluent, but we are affluent. The average wage earner in Ventura County earns 20 times the world's average. So, given that, normally we, you and I, and all our relatives and all our friends think of the act of giving as being supererogatory. Something that's we do, and when we do it, you know, we're nice. You know, there are no consequences. You know, the person at Vaughn's, you know, if I don't hit that button to give that $1, the clerk behind the counter doesn't, you know, yell out to the rest of the people in the store, hey, look at that cheapo, you know? He won't even kick in $1 for the poor. You know, that doesn't happen. But we think of ourselves, we think of the act of giving as being supererogatory when in Singer's view, it's obligatory. And he uses the following argument. Well, he says this. He says, because giving money is regarded as an act of charity, it is not thought that there is anything wrong with not giving. The charitable person is not condemned. People do not feel in any way ashamed or guilty about spending money on new clothes or a new car instead of giving it to famine relief. Indeed, the alternative does not often occur to us. So here's a radical alternative. He says, the alternative is not getting those, well, the alternative is not going to Starbucks and buying a cup of coffee when you could very well make that coffee at home and giving that money to the poor or the people in distress. The alternative is not buying new clothes when you have 5 shirts already in the closet or 5 dresses already in the closet. Not buying that new car when the old car is still, you know, putting along. It's giving anything beyond our basic needs, things that we need to sustain ourselves, to the poor, to those who are distressed in the world. And he frames a pretty strong argument. In my English class, I teach a kind of a diluted, not a diluted, but a diluted kind of logic. And he sets up what we call a deductive argument. A deductive argument has a major premise and a whole lot of minor premises and a conclusion. And his argument goes something like this. Major premise, number one, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of moral significance, then we are morally obliged to do it. Minor premise, hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering are very bad. Minor premise 3, the luxuries on which we spend money are not of moral significance. Minor premise 4, by donating money to relief agencies like Oxfam, we could prevent hunger, disease, and other sources of suffering and death. Therefore, we must morally donate money we usually spend on luxury goods to organizations that mitigate suffering. He uses an analogy. Let me get some water here. As I said, I'm out of practice. I haven't taught for a while. He uses this analogy. Suppose you had just bought a brand new dress or a brand new pair of pants, and you were walking by this fountain, and you saw a child drowning in this fountain. And you go, gee, I'd sure like to save that child, but I'm going to ruin my new pair of pants. Well, I mean, if you took that stance, people would look upon you as if you were a monster, right? So that's the same thing when you spend money on an indulgence or an luxury rather than giving it to somebody in deep distress. You're essentially doing the same thing. Now, there are a number of counters to Singer's argument, and you're probably thinking them as you're sitting there now listening to me. One of the counters is, well, you know, those people in need, they're way off in Africa somewhere, you know, or in Asia, or in a Syrian refugee camp. That would have been a good argument back in 1890, but we're in an interconnected world, and we do have these organizations that can help those in distress throughout the world nowadays. Another argument is, well, other people are around to do it. The government would do it. And Singer says, well, that would be like you're walking by this pond or this fountain, and you see this child drowning, and you go on your way, and when you get to where you want to be, people around you say, you say to the people in the room, hey, I was walking here today, and I saw this young child drowning in the fountain. And they go, well, what did you do about it? Well, I didn't do anything. There were a bunch of other people around. I figured they'd take care of it. That doesn't work. So, I mean, there are a lot of counters to this. And I've thought long and hard about Singer's argument, and I don't really have a counter. The only reaction I have to it is I find it very hard to subscribe to because I don't want to do it. And I really don't have an excuse as to why I really don't want to do it. I have sort of a feeble explanation. I can say that the decisions I make in life, the choices I make, they aren't all necessarily rational. They're not all necessarily built on reason. When I decide to do things, oftentimes I do things not just out of reason, but out of emotion, out of socialization. Even genetics come into play. So apart from reason, my emotions are something like, a singer's argument is just too severe. It's just too draconian. I'm not a desert father living in a cave somewhere wearing a hairsuit. I'm a product of the 21st century, and as far as I know, I'm only going to live this life once, and I want to make it as pleasant as possible. Another reason would be I live in a capitalistic society. This whole society is predicated on me being indulgent. Every time I turn on the TV set, there's a commercial going. Even genetically, if I want to explain things, I could say that, I have my selfish gene or genes, and I have, my altruistic part of me, and they're constantly battling each other for dominance. My selfish genetics say, it's pure Darwinism, law of the fittest. He who can gather the most resources gets to pass on his genes to his progeny. Even altruism can be explained by genetics. There are certain environmental geneticists who say, or evolutionary biologists who say that altruism has its deep roots in animal behavior. There are certain hive communities, for example, where soldier bees will lay down their lives for the rest of the hive. They point out there's a certain vervet monkey that will call out from the trees whenever he sees a leopard approaching. And that vervet monkey, well, who's the leopard going to get? It's going to get the leopard monkey who's the loudest. So, that's, the fact that sometimes I'm not reasonable, sometimes I let my emotions guide me, sometimes I can blame society, sometimes genetics come into it or deeply come into it. Does that let me off the hook? No. I have free will. I can use my reasoning. I don't have to give in to capitalism. I can control my inner monkey, so on and so forth. I guess the best I can do is, Pastor Jim kind of brought up the word the other day, and that was to be mindful. Maybe I can give a little bit more. Maybe I can distinguish between my real needs and my mere wishes. Perhaps I should keep in mind what Mother Teresa said. She said, the real problem with humanity is that from time to time we forget that we are all connected. Having said that, some days I'm just going to go out and buy a Starbucks coffee. Are there any comments? Questions, comments? Okay, thank you.